are these people?
I wanted to talk about my rant this week is about Mr. former President Ronald Reagan. And you guys are probably wondering why you're deciding to talk about Reagan, of all people. Well, one of the things that I want to do as far as, being in this space is, like initially I didn't want to be involved in independent media at all because it just kind of comes off as, people are experts, especially in politics or whatever. And I'm definitely not, I'm still kind of growing and learning, much like many of you. But I think one of the advantages I have is that, as I learn new stuff, that I'm able to share the new stuff that I do learn. So I think just trying to be a little more vulnerable in that regard. So I will never ever say that I know everything or I'm an expert of anything, but I am of the intent of being willing to learn new things, and whatever I learn is hopefully stuff that I can share with you. So this is an instance where I actually learned something, but also made a connection as to there are things that, especially in our discourse, that we don't necessarily talk about. And to my knowledge, no one necessarily asks why things are the way they are. So all of that to say, that relates to Ronald Reagan. So I actually want to talk more about him in connection to, well, public education on a large scale, but I think more specifically, student debt. Since we've talked about that, we've talked about student debt extensively on this channel for the last few months. But as I said, we never talk about why, or in this case, why we are in the position that many of us are in, as far as being straddled with student debt. And I actually came upon this tweet, I think it was last week, that, is it up, Reef? Yeah, yes. Here we go. So I came upon this tweet last week, and can't read who it is, who the ad is. I think it's Patriarch 2051.
Yes, at Patriarch 2051. You're correct.
All right. So the tweet says, the boomers were the last generation to get affordable schooling. Something missing from the conversation about student debt is the political history of why it exists. College used to be effectively free or low cost before Reagan's administration determined that college students were an organized base of political opposition to Jim Crow and war. I think in this case, the Vietnam War. Reagan encouraged state Republicans to defund public colleges in order to force future cohorts of college students to take on debt, under the theory that political activism for civil rights would feel more risky for indebted students who had more to lose. The whole point, quite literally and explicitly, was to neuter young people as a political force, written by Alexander McCoy. So as I said, I just stumbled upon this tweet last week and I thought, very interesting. Just as I said, we often talk about student debt. We hear, like especially older people, oh, I didn't have to pay that much or at all in debt, or didn't have to pay that much in college. And we never ask, how did we get from that to where we are now? So I tweeted out, hold on a second, because I lost my screen. Here we go.
There you go.
I got it. So I responded in the thread, this is, I said, meant a fact that Elizabeth Warren should be saying, but she doesn't. I wonder why. And I said, Liz Warren, you can say this for any Democrat, especially if they're promoting, a student loan cancellation. but I thought about her immediately because she is a senator in particular who always says, like, I only had to pay like X number of dollars per semester for college, and I was able to have a part-time job and being able to pay it off. Like, she said that a lot frequently, during the 2020 campaign. So I'm not saying this just to necessarily pick on her, but I'm saying this in relation to things that she has said, and how she has mentioned that, she, in our dollars, had to pay relatively little to afford her college education. So I came across this article, which is from Eric, The Educational Legacy of Ronald Reagan, by Gary K. Cladbaugh.
Okay.
Eyes work.
I know, right? You have me big, right? On the Zoom. That might help you.
Yeah, I got it on my other screen, so I'm
gotcha.
Good. So this is mostly the article, and what we'll probably do is, if you want to read it, we will link it to we'll link it in the comments or whatever. So, but history will decide whether or not Mr. Reagan ranks as a great or even good president. But the indecorous rush to laud his accomplishments featured a conspicuous omission. No one said anything about Mr. Reagan's educational legacy. What is that legacy? Let's begin with a look at his record as governor of California. While running for the governorship, Mr. Reagan shrewdly made the most of disorder on University of California campuses. For instance, he demanded a legislative investigation of alleged communism as sexual misconduct at the University of California at Berkeley. He insisted on public hearings, claiming a small minority of hippies, radicals, and filthy speech advocates had caused disorder and that they should be taken by the scruff of the neck and thrown off campus permanently. Okay.
Yeah.
Once elected, Mr. Reagan set the educational tone for his administration by calling for an end to free education for state college and university students, annually demanding 20% across-the-board cuts in higher education funding, repeated slashing construction funds for state campuses, engineering the firing of Clark Kerr, the highly respectable president of the University of California, declaring that the state should not subsidize intellectual curiosity. And Mr. Reagan certainly did not let up on the criticisms of campus protesters that aided his election. His denunciations of student protesters were both frequent and particularly venomous. He called protesting students brats, freaks, and cowardly fascists. And when it came to restoring order on unruly campuses, he observed, if it takes a bloodbath, let's get it over with. No more appeasement.
Okay.
Any thoughts on this so far, Reef?
I mean, to me, with having heard Reagan tapes before, this is par for the course. Your thoughts, it honestly reminds me of like the Nixon tape kind of stuff, right? So your thoughts so far, Yeti?
I just think it's kind of funny that you have a president of the United States that essentially resulted to grade school bullying and name calling.
Right.
It's just like, and it boggles my mind. Like, no matter what place in history you go back, since we've had like this big democracy, they call it.
Yeah.
It's always like name calling and bullshit little school tactics. It's ridiculous because at no point are we going to be able to come together if we all result in name calling. And I'm not going to say communism is perfect or any of that. There's aspects of it that I think would be beneficial to society, but to just outright call them like fascists when in actuality you are being the fascist.
Yeah, that is the campus protesters that aided his election. So these are the people that helped him. He's talking about, right? And like to me, this is partially like we've got to keep our, you know, constituency dumb, like blind, deaf, you know, like.
Yep.
So.
Well, I have a theory on Reagan, if you will let me.
Please.
I think he was the first trial run for president as an actor, and seeing how beneficial an actor could be to their like increasement of corporate overkill.
Right.
I said that horribly. Sorry.
No, you did it.
Apologize to everyone.
Trust me, we're later in this video, we could barely, you know, say our words too. So, you know, we work very hard out here, people. I'm just saying, you know,
but yeah,
words are hard.
But essentially, I think that was the first trial run to see how well having an actor as the forefront of their party would work.
Well, and you'll see later in the video. I think I kind of agree with you that Reagan to me is one of the first like neocons, right? Yeah. We're like or neo-lib, depending on which neo you'd prefer. You know.
Well, and also look at how many politicians take acting courses now.
Yeah.
It's part of like their program.
Yeah.
Sorry, if you're not acting, you don't need to act. So if you're telling the truth, you don't need to act. So if you're acting, you're lying. Why are you lying?
Right. Well, and they used to call that kind of stuff for, you know, they used to have like confidence like coaches and public speaking teachers and like whatever that were like solely there to like help people who didn't, you know, like Nixon was upset about JFK, right? Yeah. Like, and he was pretty on camera and like showed, you know, like that was the first like. And then right after that, they started realizing, oh, maybe we should try to get like people who are mildly attractive to, you know, if it's going to be a beauty pageant anyway. And
I also come from the point that I've spoken in front of large crowds.
Yeah.
Like I've spoken in front of like 1,000 people crowds before.
Yeah.
And my theory is if you're not lying, you'll feel comfortable and you'll be able to speak what you mean and people will listen.
Yep. I mean, you know, like, to me, it's just classic, like Reagan being essentially an extension of all the leadership we've had in the last like 20, 30 years, right? Yep. Or longer, depending on how far back you want to go, of this neoliberal, neoconservative teeter-totter that we go back and forth on, where the only things that we make sure to do is war, which Reagan did in droves. Yeah. Right, on top of the whole Sandinista problem, on top of the whole like Iran, you know, Contra deal, right?
To be perfectly honest, I think this is going back all the way to when Britain came over and overtook the land. I think this has just been one continual process.
Can't argue with you there.
For imperialism, I think it's just got more advanced and more almost seductive to people.
Yeah.
They've turned it into a story of glory instead of genocide.
Pretty much. That whole manifest destiny. But, you know, they streamlined the process by training them in the CIA, says Ed Heller.
The old alphabet crew.
And that's what they're doing now too. They're putting that on college campuses. I know Savvy's talked about that before. Particularly at the place Afeni was protesting at, Howard. Right after that protest, they did a whole speaking and recruiting from like the FBI, CIA. They came over and did a job. Yeah.
Well, and we know they did. We know they've done experiments. MK Ultra was a well-known experiment on mass manipulation of the people.
Yep.
Like they studied it for a reason. It wasn't so they could be like, oh, we're never going to use this again.
Right.
Whenever they've done it, whenever they study something, they're studying it for a way in which they can use it to control the masses and the population.
Yeah.
Nothing they do anymore does not veer from that goal of control.
Yeah. Very much so. perceived lack of control or actual. They do not care.
Nope.
You know, that's called the amygdala hijack, by the way. That's your flight or flight response when you have a perceived or actual lack of control of something that you want to control.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
So like your life, you kind of want to control. So therefore, you know, if any of that process gets out of your control, the lizard brain kicks in.
Oh no, I believe in fate. My theory is if I can't fix it, I can't worry about it.
Yeah.
So
but anyway, we'll get back to it.
I just happen to think I can fix the world, so I'm going to do it.
Yeah. I mean, that's how, you know, like empires are toppled pretty much. But anyway, we'll let Collin continue.
Right. But I think it's interesting, you know, like the idea that he was against, which honestly, this sounds like this could be like any modern day president, you know, like that we have now, or like at least recent history.
Yeah.
Just as far as, you know, like he hated, and again, this is new to me. This is like I was a child when Reagan was in administration. I wasn't even in the country. So, but you know, this kind of sounds like, you know, this could happen today in terms of a president being very anti-protests, you know, so doing anything to kind of squash any radical action or any sort of direct action in order to maintain order. So that sounds very familiar given the circumstances, I think, in recent years.
Especially with
what we've seen.
Obama and Bernie being the strike killers. Oh, you know, Obama only puts on that comfortable shoe to go squash the strikes. Like he did with the NBA and, you know, like, I mean, this is par for the course. So,
Okay, we'll continue. Governor Reagan slashed spending not just on higher education. Throughout his tenure as governor, he consistently and effectively opposed additional funding for basic education. The result was painful increases in local taxes and the deterioration of California's public schools. Los Angeles voters got so fed up picking up the slack that on 5 separate occasions, they rejected any further increases in local school taxes. The consequence, underfunding, resulted in overcrowding classrooms, ancient worn-out textbooks, crumbling buildings, and badly demoralized teachers. Ultimately, half the Los Angeles Unified School District's teachers walked off the job to protest conditions in their schools. Mr. Reagan was unmoved.
Half the Los Angeles school districts walked off the job.
Yeah.
That's ridiculous.
Seems that way. Ronald Reagan left California public education worse than he had found it. A system that had been the envy of the nation when he was elected was in decline when he left. Nevertheless, Mr. Reagan's actions had political appeal, particularly to his core conservative constituency, again, can't read, it's late, many of whom had no time for public education. In campaigning for the presidency, Mr. Reagan called out for the total elimination of the U.S. Department of Ed, severe curtailment of bilingual education, and massive cutbacks in the federal role in education. Upon his election, he tried to do that and more. Significantly, President Reagan also took steps to increase state power over education at the expense of local school districts. Federal funds that flowed directly to local districts were redirected to state government. Moreover, federal monies were provided to beef up education staffing at the state level. The result was to seriously erode the power of local school districts. As in California, Mr. Reagan also made drastic cuts in the federal education budget. Over his 8 years in office, he diminished it by half. When he was elected, the federal share of total education spending was 12%. When he left office, it stood at just
6%.
Yeah.
The federal share of total was only 6%.
Right.
and like, I mean, it was only 12%, and he
Right.
slashed that.
Right.
Okay, of course, half of them left then.
Right. Mr. Reagan was far more successful in giving corporate managers unprecedented influence over the future of public education. Reagan's avowed purpose was to make America more competitive in the world economy. Corporate executives dabbled in public education had no discernible influence on America's competitiveness, but the influence of big business did undermine the power of parents and locally elected school board members. It also suggested that it was far more important for schools to turn out good employees than to produce good citizens or decent human beings.
Okay.
So, you know, I've kind of ranted on this before, personally to you.
Right.
But I feel basically this is kind of spot on in terms as a teacher of what I'm kind of been a witness to. You know, like we're not teaching students to challenge the establishment. We're teaching them to essentially become worker bees to capitalism.
Yes.
You know, so
in what way would you like to see it different there? Right? Like how would you like the kids to engage and the parents to engage? You know?
Right. But I think essentially with Reagan, essentially what he did, you know, is that he defunded, you know, public education so much that essentially he took autonomy away from school districts, took autonomy from parents, and essentially took away autonomy of free thinking, essentially. So that, you know, so that now it's just become more, schools has essentially become, you know, petri dishes for corporatism, basically. You know, you're not teaching them essentially, you're basically teaching them skill sets.
Yeah, it's the classic, it's the reason why they made sure slaves couldn't read. Like it's the same thing.
Right.
Like you defund education, you can't combat the system that because you don't understand it.
Right.
You know.
So I want to briefly, well, it won't be so brief, but I wanted to watch this video. So I think it's about, so this is shoot, I forgot the guy who created this, or at least the channel. But again, I'm tired. But he kind of goes into, you know, so we talked more about public education in particular, but he's going to go more into student debt.
Digitech or critical something critical dispatch, maybe?
Yeah, critical dispatch. There we go.
That's it.
So we'll link his video. We'll link on the page as well. But he basically goes into, you know, we talked about, you know, how Reagan defunded public education. He's going to go more into more specifically about how it is that we now are in a position when we look to higher education, that many of us are in student debt. So.
Oh, it's muted.
Oh.
Where the federal and state government funded public universities.
And I can like do this.
Yeah, start over, but it's not a couple of seconds back, so it's fine.
There was a time in this country when public university was virtually tuition free, where the federal and state government funded public universities and considered accessible higher education to be a state asset. But like many other things in the United States, a major political shift changed that dramatically.
Pat Brown, like Lyndon Johnson, was an organizer of power, the willing tool of those who believed in tax and tax, spend and spend.
And if I've learned anything in my time as a public policy researcher, if something in America is going really wrong, it's always a safe bet to blame Ronald Reagan. This is why you have student loan debt.
But academic freedom cannot be used as an excuse for fiscal license or as a screen for excessive spending.
Ronald Reagan and many other right-wing presidents did not have a good relationship with college students or college faculty. He held a particular distaste for the campus activism that was reaching its peak in the late 60s during his run for governor of California. On the campaign trail, he did his very best to paint campus protests about the draft, the war in Vietnam, and civil rights as illegitimate.
Or do we no longer think it necessary to teach self-respect, self-discipline, and respect for law and order? Will we allow a great university to be brought to its knees by a noisy dissident minority? Will we meet their neurotic vulgarities with vacillation and weakness?
He considered these the actions of beatniks, anarchists, and filthy speech advocates who simply wanted to riot and cause chaos. This wasn't about academic freedom and integrity or the preservation of civil liberties. This was about moral decency and the character of a nation. All of this language should sound familiar to you. This is the Reagan playbook.
That interest is because this generation, these young people, have been indoctrinated, they have been hammered throughout their lifetime with the idea of the all-important security.
He used it when he ran for governor, he used it when he ran for president, and Republicans have been pulling from this playbook for decades now. So when Ronald Reagan became the governor of California, he went on the attack. He cut California state funding for public higher education, started to set the precedent for public universities to shift to a tuition-based model, and he even went as far as to bring the National Guard in to quash student protests. He was able to do this because he moved the public discourse on higher education. Rather than seeing access to higher education as a national asset, he framed universities as a problem, unpatriotic institutions, welfare queens that drained public funds, practically socialism. Under his tenure, not only did they cut state funding for public universities, but they also changed laws allowing higher fees to be assessed from students in order to make up for budget shortfalls. And to further bridge the artificially created budget gap, they let colleges take in greater numbers of out-of-state students who were expected to pay higher fees, which twisted the incentives for universities to recruit from pools of out-of-state students. After his tenure as governor, Reagan continued his assault of public education as president. Overall grants to support education decreased, and federal guidance around student loan initiatives started to take shape. A raft of states followed the lead of California in decreasing public spending on higher education. And why not? Reagan set the agenda. He won a landslide victory in his race for governor and spent his entire campaign villainizing college students and universities. He did the same during his campaign for presidency, and he won 49 states. The message was clear. The American people didn't care if you defunded every important public institution we had, as long as you don't raise our taxes. 1984 was the last year that a university class received more grants than they did loans. After that, America abandoned funding its public universities at a level that doesn't saddle generations of students with crippling debt. America became a country that thinks reducing deficit spending is more important than social mobility, but never actually cut deficit spending. The federal deficit actually went up substantially during the Reagan presidency, which means public higher education was gutted, essentially for nothing. Reagan was successful. He rebranded public institutions as wasteful, debt-generating welfare queens, even though it's been clear for decades that investments in public universities and higher education pay dividends. It boosts the economy, creates jobs and innovation, and allows for more social mobility. A more highly educated citizenry produces better outcomes for the country as a whole. But that highly educated citizenry are also prone to act out against the current political order, as they did in the 60s and the 70s. Reagan and his advisors couldn't allow that to happen, so they set a new agenda and changed American life, perhaps irreparably. So the next time you're wondering why you have so much student loan debt, remember that you have Ronald Reagan to blame.
Oh, what do I think? I mean, so he started the student debt shit for the most part.
Yeah.
You know,
he did.
So,
Well, I would say I don't think he started it. I think he just perfected it,
right.
you know. So,
And put everything in place to make it the worst possible, and the worst possible, like, education disparity, right?
right.
Like,
But I think it's interesting how it was the idea of like, we cannot have college students uprise. We cannot
Yeah.
have that, you know? So, you know, and it's funny how like we talk about this now, you know, like we cannot have the poor's uprise and come against, you know, the elites. So we
Right.
have to do everything to minimize that, you know, so
So that
give
not
them
only
loans,
not
give
only
them
are you
loans. So
right.
go
Not
ahead.
only are you trying to like combat the level of education that like public schools are able to give you, right? But then also making it to where you have to control the educated that are being made anyway,
Right.
you know, and like
Right.
just in case that because they're gonna realize what you're doing, essentially,
Right.
you know. Okay.
So it's really the idea, you know, like, you know, don't educate them. You can educate them, but not too much. You know, you can give them healthcare, but, you know, like, but we won't give it to you, you know,
Well, and you're gonna
at the
have to
point of service, you know, like,
play ball
you
with us,
have a job, but
essentially.
we won't give you that much money.
Right.
Mm. So
You
it's the
know.
idea, like, it's the idea of giving you just enough mobility, but not fully, so that like you can be at a position where you could make a stand against the elites if,
Yeah.
you know, like you kind of catch wind as to, oh, like that's some fuck shit in
Right.
terms of what they're doing and how they're oppressing, you know, the working class. So, but I thought it was interesting, you know, like, again, this is new to me, but it's something that I have been thinking about in terms of like, we talk about student debt, when student debt, when student debt, but we don't even talk about like why we end up in this place.
Yeah.
So that brings me to,
There was a time in this country when public
nope.
university was virtually to
Okay, so that brings me to Elizabeth Warren. She was recently on The View. I think this was taken within like the last month or so. Not gonna watch the whole thing because I know how a lot of us are not fans of The View, but I did want to watch this part where they start talking about student debt and notice what she says. So, and then we can talk a little bit more about that. Actually, let me see if I can play it on my own here. Hold on.
Force them to care.
So I want to switch gears a little bit to student loans. I mean, you've been fiercely advocating for the president to cancel student loan debts, but really only 13% of Americans even have federal student loan debt. So is this really the best way to reach most voters? And also, what do you say to someone like me who worked 2 jobs for a decade to pay off all their student loans, just finished? Where do I sign up for reimbursement?
So let's start out with who has student loans today. About 40% of the folks with student loans don't have a college diploma. They're folks who tried.
Yeah.
They're folks who tried and life happened. Pregnancies, they were already working 2 jobs and lost one of them. Mom got sick, family had to move somewhere else. And now they earn what a high school grad earns, and they're trying to pay off college level debt, and it is crushing their bones. Keep in mind that of those who have student loan debt, more than half have negative wealth. They don't have any wealth.
And they're
So-
older also. A lot of them are over 50, I was reading.
You know that right now there are tens of thousands of people who are living on Social Security who are having their Social
my
Security
God.
checks garnished to pay student loans. And so this, for me, is a question of fairness. There was a time in America when we invested in our public colleges and universities. That's how I could go to a college that cost $50 a semester, pay for it on part-time jobs. But today that option is not out there for our young people. So this is about saying, look, it's tough, we understand that. We want to invest in you. We want to invest in your getting an education.
Like, she said a lot of the right things. You know, she mentioned, you know, like the reality of what many of us, especially if you went into college and dropped out, that you're still having to pay that debt and you're not reaping the benefits of, you know, the degree that you tried to get. So
Right.
I'm glad that she mentioned all of that. The one thing, again, she didn't mention, again, she mentioned there was a time where college was affordable, or if not free, you know, and then immediately meant to jump into, but we don't have that anymore. And Senator Warren, you have an idea of what happened in between, you know, like what was the cause as to why we're shifted into the system that we had now. I think a lot of it, in my opinion, has to deal with the fact that this was during the time when she was not like, I wouldn't say shady, but I think hasn't really talked about this a lot, but she was a Republican during this time. So I think that has a lot to why she may not necessarily say it, but again, I'm not just kind of looking at her, I'm just using her an example. You know, this is something that the Democrats should be saying, you know, like the reason why people are in debt is in part due to what, you know, Reagan, who was a Republican, you know, caused as far as defunding public education in this country. And it's something that we need to return to, you know, so you can blame, you know, like obviously Reagan, you know, kind of did us in, you know, just as far as, you know, the amount of debt that many people are in now, but the Democrats are just as complicit in the idea of like, especially people who have been in office for a while, they're aware of what Reagan did to defund education, and but they're not saying that piece. They're not saying like, oh, this is in light of because of this that you're suffering now, and so
or do they do anything about it? Like
Right.
they could also, if they didn't say anything but did something, you know, like if you want to try to reverse those like policies, great, you know.
Right. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring this up, you know, because I think that's a piece regarding student loan debt that we are not talking about. You know, we talk about the before and we talk about the end result, but we don't talk about the why and how as to we got to this point. And so I think really that's where we need to kind of go into as far as conversations. I think regarding education in general, you know, like the idea, like we know now, especially, you know, watching these videos or reading the article, you know, we didn't have a system where thousands of people, millions of people were in debt. We never had that, but now we do. So ideally, we need to kind of make that shift back to how it was before, you know, prior to the 80s, you know. So I've loved to see, you know, other, you know, personalities in independent media mention this, you know, just as far as, you know, how we got to this place. So, but I just wanted to kind of bring that up, you know, in part because, again, I didn't know this, or at least I had the idea as to maybe thinking about it, but I didn't necessarily know the why up until maybe this week. But I think this part is missing from the conversation that, you know, I think we need to talk about more. And I think also kind of challenge our politicians, if we are in that opportunity where we can, to be like, look, this is due to what the Republicans have done, you know, but what are you doing about it? Like you're remaining complicit in what has the damage that has been done, you know, to millions of people that they're crippling in debt now, and you're not making any moves as far as making any changes so that we would be less so, you know. So but yeah, I think that's all I got to say on that, you know, unless you have anything else that you want to add.
No, I mean, I've always felt like Reagan was a piece of shit, so
Yeah.
you know.
Well, I think, you know, I've always, you know, again, he was, you know, president when I was a child and not in this country. So
Yeah.
I didn't necessarily know Reagan like that, but I think more recently, just knowing a little bit more about him, just being like, he in a lot of ways is a catalyst to how our system, especially in terms of how capitalist our country has become. He's definitely kind of the figure as to why in our modern age that a lot of things are as decrepit as they are now.
Well, it also felt like he started a lot of like what the neoliberal agenda, in my opinion, of like the wars the way we have them now, things like that. Like, to me, it was a similar start there, right? Where it's, he's regime changing and being combative with Russia and, that kind of stuff.
Right.
I mean, the Sandinistas and, I mean, not to mention how he started with like the Iranian, hostages or whatever, right? The whole hostage situation, which like, there's the whole thing about like that being a setup from the get-go, right?
Right.
That, so what did he say? That in my heart of hearts, these things I think are true. Something dumb like that. But
yeah.
But yeah,
I think it's just, I think again, we need to kind of dig a little deeper into this. I think not just this issue, but I think other issues that I think we just kind of glean around, the surface as far as, oh, we need this and this happens to us now. But I think kind of looking at the root of like a lot of the issues that we have, and and thinking like through like, how do we get to the places where we are now, and what can we do to, really uproot that problem so that we're able to make the radical changes that we want to see.
Right.
So, so like I said, we don't talk about Reagan at all in terms of student loan debt. And I think we need to, just so people, but I think just mostly for people to understand, like, one, it never used to be like this. Number two, that there is a direct cause, with the with the capitalists who are leading our country and the world, that this was intentional. But it's interesting that it was based on the idea of like, we don't want people to catch on to what we're doing, that they start going against us. So we're going to give you debt as a way to kind of enslave you so that you feel that you have a lot to lose if you do, which I think is kind of like the theme that we've kind of seen, especially within the last few years in terms of just our livelihoods, that, it affects our money, it affects our health, it affects our time, that we're not able to do the uprising that I think we should be doing.
Right. No, I couldn't agree more. Interesting. All right. I think that's what, 37 minutes? I think we've had these future people listen to us enough. What do you think?
That's fair.
Yeah, I want to go to bed now.
Yeah. All right. Good night. Enjoy the rest of the show, everybody.
Who are these people?
What are your thoughts, Yeti? Anything closing on that?
No, I think he did a really good job of explaining.
Yeah,
I know he's saying he was a little tired, but it's pretty concise.
Yes.
I know he felt a little tired, but I think he did a really good job.
Yeah.
And I commend him for it, because he's always been really good about this stuff and really well-spoken and outspoken individual.
Yeah, I like Care Bear. Care Bear is the best. People can go check out his stuff down below. Follow him on Twitter. I'm sure he's got some Cash App and Patreon's places if you want to leave him some fucking some choice little dollar dues. You know what I'm saying?